Now we had a look at lazy loading in this component, and lazy loading like this still works and is perfectly fine. If you are using React 16.6, and you can check this in the package.json file, and I have a new demo project here, by the way, which you find attached to this lecture and which you should download, extract, npm install, and then npm start. So if you are using that latest React version here, or React 16.6 or higher, then you have a new way of lazy loading your routes. Because React 16.6 adds a new method on the React object, the lazy method, which you can use to load your data, your components asynchronously, which means only when they are needed. And let's have a look at how this works now. So React Lazy is a method that was added with React 16.6 that allows us to load components asynchronously, which means they are only loaded, the code behind them is only loaded when they are really required, when they are being rendered. And this is, for example, useful when having routing in your application, because only when a user visits a certain route, that component will be required, and React Lazy allows you to defer the rendering and the loading of the code of that component until it is required. And this, of course, means that you don't load redundant code in advance. It's not just useful for routing, by the way. Whenever you have a use case where some component is loaded at a later point of time, for example, because you have an if check and some condition needs to be met to render a certain component, in all such cases, you could use React Lazy. But let me show you how it works. So let's go to the app.js file, and here I'm using React Router DOM to set up my browser router. I'm using React Fragment here, which is a feature that was added with React 16.2. It's basically the same as our aux component we created manually. It's basically a component that you can use to, wrap other components, because you always need that wrapping component in React. It does not render a real DOM element and therefore does not distort your DOM. And inside of that fragment, I have a little dummy navigation, and then I have 3 routes here. And if we have a look at that, we are on the welcome page by default, and we can switch to the user and the posts page. Okay, so that is this application, nothing fancy thus far. Now, we could use React Lazy to only load the user and the posts component when we need them. Right now, everything is loaded in advance, but we might never visit these routes. So loading the code behind them in advance is not ideal. If that were an even bigger app with more code behind these components, the issue would of course be worse. So we want to load these 2 components only when we need them. And we can do that with this new lazy method. How is this method used? Well, let's start with the posts component. Instead of importing it like this, which will always force the data to be loaded in advance, we need to use a dynamic import, just as we did with that async component we created earlier in this module. We need to use a dynamic import. So we create a constant for that, which we name posts. You could name it whatever you want. I just name it posts so that I can continue to use that name down there. And the value of that constant here will be a call to react.lazy, this new method that was added with React 16.6. Now let's also move these imports to the top to not get any linting warnings. And now inside of React Lazy, we pass a function. Here I'll use an arrow function, which returns an import statement. And this is a dynamic import, which means it's basically executed when this code runs, and React will execute it when we try to render this component. And here we again still point to the file which contains our posts component. And important for that, we should use default exports. Named exports are not supported. So now I'm importing my post component, but only when this function runs, which means only when React thinks that we need to use it. And React thinks that we need to use it when it detects that it needs to render that. Now with that changed, let's go down to that route here. And there we now need to make a little change. Instead of using that component, let's use the render method here. There we would receive all these route props, but in the end here, I want to return something. I want to return a component that should be rendered. And there I now need to import a new component from React, the suspense component. And with it imported, that is what I want to render here. Suspense, like this. And in between, I'll render posts. So my constant as a component here. And now let's add one more thing to that suspense component, and that's the fallback prop, which should be some JSX code. And there I'll add div where I say loading. And this will actually be displayed in cases where React basically postpones the rendering of this wrapped component and shows this, well, fallback in the meantime. And of course, that doesn't have to be a div with loading. That could be a spinner or anything like that. And now with all that, let's save that, go back to the front page, load the users page, load the post page, all working. So what's special? Well, we can see what's special when we reload the page and then go to the network tab. Now, after reloading, clear it, and now click on the post page. And you will see that there it loaded a new file, and that is the file holding the code for this component. And that is async rendering and async loading in action. Because this component and its code is only fetched and rendered when we really need it. And therefore, we avoid loading everything in advance, which can of course drastically improve the performance of your application, depending on its size. So this is a neat alternative to the other way of lazy loading pages which we had before. A great advantage of this approach is that we of course cannot just use this in a routing scenario. We could of course also have a scenario where we don't use that browser router, so let me comment all of that out. And instead, let's say I have a simple button here where I say toggle mode or anything like that. We add a new method to this component here, mode handler, and we add a state where we say show, and it's false initially, let's say, and then there I call this set state in the function form of set state, so we can access the old state. We return the updated state or our update to the state, and I'll set show to the opposite of what it previously was, so that I toggle that show mode. And of course, you can also name this differently. Now we have that button. Now I bind on click here to this mode handler. And now I just want to render either the user or the post page depending on that mode. Of course, you can also name that show posts, for example. Update it here too. And now let's add a simple check where you check if this state show posts. If that is true, then I want to render my posts. And for that, I will also grab this code with suspense, of course. So let's copy that and move it up there. Comment that back in. Put that in brackets. So I want to render with suspense my posts if show post is true. Otherwise, I'll render my user component like this. Now, since I have two adjacent components here, I'll again use React fragment or use the aux component, of course, and wrap this. And now with this changed, if I go back and I click on toggle mode, we see that chunk was loaded and we see the post page. So here we also take advantage of this async rendering. And that is really something useful and a great addition with React 16.6. We'll see more on that async rendering thing in future versions. And right now, this is what we can use, React Lazy. Please be aware that this will not work if you're trying to server-side render this. Then this is not supported. This API will not work there yet. But if you have a client-side rendered application, as we have it here in the course, then this is a great addition and definitely something you want to check out for cases where you conditionally render some component, be that in an if statement or be that in a routing scenario. Now, of course, one thing to keep in mind, the benefit you'll get out of this will be greater if you have larger chunks of data behind your components. If you have very simple components, using suspense might actually be overkill and could even slow down your application or be suboptimal at this point of time. So lazy loading the code, of course, shows its full strength if we're talking about bigger chunks of code.